Okay friends, welcome to part 4 of our video presentation on database design. In this brief video presentation, I will talk about the overall approach towards developing a database model. So we'll talk about the so-called stages of developing a database model. Now, the process of developing a database model consists of the following 4 general steps. First, you create the so-called context data model. Now, context data model includes only entities and their relationships. So it's really like a sketch of your future full-scale database model or database system, and it's only meant to establish the scope of the entire project or the entire database. So that's step number 1. Step number 2, once you have entities and their relationships, you create the so-called key-based data model. So, which means that you add primary keys to each of the entities that you modeled in step 1, and then you appropriately implement relationships using those keys by inserting foreign keys into appropriate entities and so forth. This is also the step where you eliminate non-specific or many-to-many relationships by adding associative entities. You also make sure that all primary keys are included, and then also based on that you fine-tune your cardinalities to make sure that all cardinalities are correct. So that's step number 2. In step number 3, you create full attributed data model, which means that you add all remaining attributes to the entities that you have as a result of step 1 and step 2. And then during step 4, you normalize data model. In other words, you make sure that your data model is good, scalable, non-redundant, and this is something that we're going to talk about in our next video presentation. So normalization is the last step. Throughout all those 4 steps, you keep track of data about data. In other words, you create some kind of metadata repository where you keep track of all the attributes, all the keys that you create, what they store, what kind of data type they have, and so forth. So this is basically means record keeping. You keep track of what you're doing, what kind of attributes you're creating for what kind of entities you have, so that when you go back to your database design, or when somebody else wants to revisit your database model, they can look at the descriptions and quickly figure out what kind of intent, what kind of purpose, what kind of elements your data model has. So those are the 4 general steps. Now, even before you go into step 1, which is context data model, you need to discover entities. In other words, you need to figure out what kind of entities you will have in your database model. So how do you figure out what kind of entities you will need to have in your database model? Well, to make it simple, you figure those things out by talking to end users. Okay. Now, this conversation can be a part of interviews. It can also be a part of joint requirements planning, or JRP. Now, JRP are basically structured, not structured, but planned interviews where users and developers get together to talk about the potential requirements towards a database. So when you interview users, when you talk to them, pay special attention to such words or phrases such as we need to keep track of, we need to store information, we need to record. So those phrases would indicate that there is a need to record something. And once you figure out that there is a need to record something, you create an entity for that something or somebody. To steer users in the right kind of direction, you may ask them directly to identify things or people or events about which they would like to capture, store, and produce information. So that would be an indicator that you need to have an entity for that. You can also study existing forms, files, and reports, because if those forms, and especially files and reports, exist, it means that data about something needs to be, has been stored in the form of those files and reports. So it also means that this is something that needs to be stored in your database. Also, you can scan use case narratives, meaning like user stories or user requirements about what the system needs to do for certain nouns. So those nouns may represent entities or the need to store something. And there are some automated case tools that can reverse engineer existing files and databases. For example, those tools, they can scan existing records and identify entities, and this will be like automated help in the process of discovering entities. So there are some specialized tools, case tools for that as well. So let's talk more about the first step, which is creating a context data model. So a context data model would look something like this. You just have entities and also relationships between among those entities. So this is like a rough sketch that helps you establish the scope of the entire database. Now, the key-based data model means that once you have this context model, you start adding primary and foreign keys into appropriate entities. So this entity contains keys only. And then once you have a key-based data model, you have the so-called full attributed data model, which means that in addition to having keys, you add all the necessary attributes. Okay? So this is the third step, which is creating a full attributed data model. And the fourth step means normalizing your data model. Now, normalizing means making sure that your data model is good. And good means, it's simple, it's non-redundant, and it's also flexible or scalable for future needs. So we'll stop here because we will talk more about normalizing data model or step number 4 in our 5th video presentation. So thank you for listening.